Okay, and you can see my bio there up on the screen. I fell into this line of work many years ago when I was in graduate school, and there was a professor who wanted to run a study to see if SAT scores were a sign of intelligence, and his theory is that they were not. And so he wanted to recruit some students to see how high they could push their scores if they were studying for the test. I needed the extra money while I was a poor graduate student, and they were paying by the hour. So I got really into this study. I ended up with a perfect score at the end of a 6-month period. And along the way, inadvertently developed a unique new way to prep for the SAT and its close cousin, the ACT. And a lot of that came from I was working at a research center at the time. We were doing a lot of cutting edge research on learning and creative ways to engage and motivate students. And so I ran little experiments with that handful of first students that heard about the perfect score, and then they wanted to work with me. And we saw this stuff really worked, and very accidentally, Test Prep Gurus was born. And now, gosh, I think we're 16 years later, and we've got a huge team of 30 people, and we work with kids all through Southern California at our in-person locations. We work with them virtually. We run classrooms virtually. And then we work with a number of students around the country, in the middle of the country and on the East Coast virtually, and then in 12 other countries besides. So that's Test Prep Gurus. And now that we've got the introduction out of the way, we talked about what we're going to do. Let's jump into it. And I wanted to start with this new piece of information that I uncovered recently. Now we've got a chance to get everybody into the room. So we ran a survey. We sent it out to 12,000 people on our email newsletter. And we asked, what questions would you like to have addressed in some of our upcoming webinars regarding college admissions? And I was really surprised at the responses from students. A number of them asked some version of this question: does going to college even matter? In all my years of doing this, that's never really been a question. And so I followed up with a number of these students, and they sent me to a number of influencers on Instagram and TikTok primarily, who were pushing this narrative that college is some sort of a financial scam. And so I wanted to address that real quick, because in talking to parents about this, I'm the father of a sophomore in high school. Most of us, if not nearly all of us, have no idea that this narrative is being pushed online, and it's a conversation that's happening without our participation. So it's something that we want to bring to light for families, that they can discuss in the home and talk about what makes the most sense to them. Just to throw out some numbers here to help everybody understand what they're looking at. And I'm going to, we're just going to go like this to make the screen a little cleaner. There we go. All right. So this shows median earnings with each additional level of education. We've got less than a high school diploma at the bottom. Average lifetime earnings are 1.2 million. Of course, there are exceptions to this. I know some people who have a high school degree, but never finished college or never even went to college, and they are incredibly wealthy. Again, we're just talking averages here, right? This is just to get a sense of what is most likely for the middle of the pack. So 1.2 million, if you have less than a high school diploma. With a high school diploma, rises to 1.6. And then you've got various levels of education here. You can see it goes higher with a bachelor's degree, with a master's degree, and then all the way up with a professional degree. $4.7 million is the average, the midpoint in lifetime earnings for somebody with a professional degree. So there is a lot of evidence to back up that, yes, going to college does matter. And I think there are all kinds of benefits that come from going to college besides just monetary ones. But the questions that we got from students were very focused on the monetary benefits of going to college or not. And so that's what I wanted to address here right at the beginning. And this graph here shows the ranges. So this shows the middle 50% of earners, right? That dot, if we look at, say, some college, this dot right here in the middle, I don't know if you can see my arrow on your end, but if we go up to the third from the bottom, some college, 1.9 million is the right in the middle. And then you've got 25% of people down to 1.3 and 25% up to 2.7, right? So there's some wiggle room in there, but you can see the most wiggle room again, as we go up the graph with more education, there's more wiggle room. There's a higher upside, goes all the way up to 8.4 million with that professional degree. And professional degrees would include a, your JD to be a lawyer, your medical degree to be a doctor, an MBA if you're going to work in business, which is the route that I went. And so there we can see 25% earn between 4.7 and 8.4, 25% earn between 2.9 and 4.7. And then, of course, there are exceptions on either end of that. There are people that earn less than that and people that earn more than that, another 25% on each end. Yeah. And so hopefully this should spark some discussion, especially with our students that see the recording or are on the call tonight. And yeah, the education is a good investment still. What's interesting here is they did not adjust these numbers for inflation when they project into the future. And so for kids going to college today, we would actually expect these numbers to be quite a bit higher. Does it matter where you go to college? This was the other question that really surprised us from our students. Again, they were pointing us to the same influencers that talk about the top schools are a scam and there's really no difference in where you go. Now, this is nuanced, okay? Because I'm not a big fan of college rankings. I think college rankings are a bit misleading because students come away with the impression that the number 3 school is better than the number 7 school. The rankings are not meant to be a fine-tuned instrument. It's more like a top 50 school, a top 100 school. That's a better way to look at it. Think about it with a broad brush. It's not a surgical instrument, it's a blunt instrument. Now, if we are again talking about income only, there's some data to back up where you go to school does matter. Oh yeah, and a little bit more on how the right, because we want to talk about how two things can be true at once, right? One, on the one hand, rankings are not everything. On the other, they do kind of point you in the right direction. But I thought this is a great book. Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Be by Frank Bruni. You can have all kinds of opportunities no matter where you go to college. What you do with your college experience, the choices you make, and the level of engagement are more important than the institution's reputation. Absolutely. College rankings often do not accurately reflect the quality of an education and can be misleading in determining the quote unquote best college for an individual. Rankings should be individualized to each person. Harvey Mudd, Caltech, MIT, they have amazing engineering programs. Their art programs, if they have them at all, are not the best in the country, right? And so it depends if you want to be an engineering major, if those are the right colleges for you, or if you want to go be an art major or something else. And so we want to, again, these rankings are painted with a broad brush, and it should be individualized to each kid on what is the best school or the best range of schools for each student. Now, on the other hand, this is a nice metaphor that a tutor recently came up with. There are many ways to make a fire, right? You can rub sticks together, but if you want to move up that income scale, you can see that more education helps. More education is like somebody handing you some matches and some lighter fluid to help make those things happen. And if we, again, look at income here as related to colleges, nearly a third of Claremont McKenna students, right up here in Claremont McKenna students from the bottom 20% of income wind up in the top 1% after graduating from Claremont McKenna. Only 1% of college students attend the highly selective Ivy Plus colleges. So Ivy Plus, we're going to hear that term a few times tonight. It means the Ivy League plus other uber highly ranked schools, Chicago, MIT, Stanford, Duke, schools of that nature. These students, less than 1% attend these schools, but they eventually account for 15% of those in the 0.1% end of the income distribution. And then Ivy Plus graduates make up a quarter of U.S. senators, half of all Rhodes Scholars, 3/4 of Supreme Court justices appointed in the last half century. So again, two things can be true at once. Rankings aren't everything, but they are a general indicator towards opportunities. And so I just wanted to nip this conversation in the bud, put in my 2 cents on, yes, going to college does matter. It's going to likely increase choices for you in your life. And that's why we're concentrating on this. Now, I think a good way to go about this when we're trying to figure out, where do I want to go? What are the right schools for me? I want to start with the right questions, because usually kids start with, what's the highest ranked school I can get into? Or do I have to take the SAT? These aren't the right questions. We want to start with really basic stuff like, what are my goals for the future? Who do I want to become? What are the things I want to go accomplish in the world? And these are big questions, right? High school students usually don't have clear-cut answers to them, but having a conversation along these lines is one of the best things parents can do with their kids. For the students on the call, ask your friends some of these questions. It will lead to interesting conversations, if nothing else. Ask them, if you have no idea where you might want to go or what you might want to do, ask some friends, teachers. You have great counselors at Modern Day. Go into the counseling lounge and have a chat with one of them and just say, what do you see from me in the future? And even if they say things that you reject, well, that's helping you to narrow down what you might want to go do and who you want to be in the future. The next layer of this is going to be, will going to college help me achieve those goals? Help me become that person I want to become? Then we narrow it down a little further. What specific colleges will help me to achieve those goals, to do the things I want to do in the world, become the person I want to become? And then finally, we narrow it down to, will an SAT or an ACT score help me to earn admission to those schools? And as you move through this list, and this is a long process, right? It's very fluid and it'll change over time as you go through school. But as we move through this, we're trying to get colleges into 3 buckets. Ideally, we have some safety schools, some target schools, and some reach schools. And I'll give you an example to make this a little bit easier to understand. So there's a student that we are currently working with. She's interested in being a veterinarian, very passionate about it, doing all kinds of things with animals and raising a seeing eye dog. And this very much looks like her path. So she did some research on schools. She found out Cornell, which is in the Ivy League, has a great veterinary sciences program, right? So that's going to be a reach school because they're under 10% in their admission rate. She found UC Davis has a great veterinary sciences program. That's going to be a target school, especially for a California student. She found a school in New Zealand that accepts more than 80% of the students that apply, but they have a world-ranked veterinary sciences program. That's going to be a safety school for her. And so those are her 3 buckets. And then the next step is to find more schools. And hopefully each time we have 1 in each bucket. And then again, we put 1 more in each bucket and build our list up that way. And maybe you end up applying to 6 schools, maybe 9 schools, maybe 12 schools. It's going to differ from kid to kid. There is no one right number. Talk to your counselors at Modern Day. It's really nice when I have a webinar and I can say, you have great counselors at your school. Take advantage of that. Let them guide you through this process. If anybody tells you you need to apply to 30 or more colleges, you might want to ignore their advice, right? One thing that we find these days, there's a lot of kids applying to too many schools, and it actually hurts their chances of getting into their top choice schools. It works like this. Kids think, if I apply to more schools, I only need one to say yes. So the bigger net I cast, the more chances I have. But the thing is, all of these schools require supplemental essays and extra pieces of information. And so you're spreading yourself thinner and thinner and thinner. And those colleges don't want a boilerplate essay that applies to all colleges. They want to know who you are authentically, but they also want to know how you're going to fit into the culture of their college. And so writing those supplemental statements specific to the needs and wants of the culture of those schools, that's what will help you stand out. And so make sure you have a balanced list, not too many, not too few. Tap your counselors. They'll walk you through this process. Okay, let's talk about college entrance exams. That's kind of general advice on college. Now we're going to move into the standardized testing piece of it and what's going on with college entrance exams, because that's where there's the most change, the most movement in college admissions right now. Do scores help? This is a big question in college admissions, and especially from families who are currently applying. I think this piece of data speaks for itself. So these are all the colleges that actively publish their admissions rate when a student doesn't have a test score or when they do have a test score. And this includes both SAT and ACT. So we've got Amherst, Boston, Colgate, Davidson, Emory, Notre Dame, Tufts. I'm going to actually make this just a little bit bigger for everybody for a second, just so you can really see it. Notre Dame, Tufts, Penn, USC, Virginia, Vanderbilt, Wellesley. And go ahead, try the chat box, because if anybody has a question at any moment, feel free to throw it into the chat box. Let me know what you notice about this graph. What stands out to you? And to give a little bit more information, the gray bars for each school that's the admissions rate without a test score, and the red bars are for applying with a test score. I'm just going to check the chat here for a second. Okay. Okay, yes, thank you for that response. The red bars are higher than the gray bars, and it runs at all of the schools, right? So every single school that publishes this data, we do see kids get in at a higher rate when they apply with a test score. And there are some examples that jump out more than others. Boston College, you have a 9.6 admission rate when you apply without a test score. It's under 10%, very difficult to get in, but it goes all the way up to nearly 26%, more than doubles when you have a test score. Notre Dame also more than doubles. And there are numerous other examples up there you can check out for yourself. University of Virginia has a huge gap. Some schools, the gaps are a little bit less. But one trend that we're really seeing is year over year, ever since COVID and the move to test optional, is that the gaps are getting bigger each year. So if you're currently a junior, you can expect that scores are going to matter. And if you're currently a sophomore, they will probably matter even more. We certainly will. We've already seen a difference with USC. I think on this graph, it's basically there's a 40% increase in terms of your chances of getting in if you have a test score. That number has gone way up as of this year with the new information from USC that we haven't put into this graph yet. And one thing to really consider here, because there was a student that I spoke to recently who he saw a admissions rep from a school that you all know. I'm not going to say who it is, but he spoke to a class of more than 100 students at once, and he said every student in this room should apply to our college. And this is a very selective school, right around a 10% admission rate. He said everyone should apply because it doesn't matter what your grades are, doesn't matter what your test scores are, it doesn't even matter if you have test scores. You should apply because we take all kinds of kids. Now, I think that's a nice message, but if we think about it, what's that person really up to there? We can see from the stats at this school that they don't actually admit everybody. They actually have an extremely high average GPA for admitted students. It's over 4.0. They have extremely high SAT and ACT scores for who they admit. And the 2/3 of the kids that they admit have test scores. So they clearly really like that. They're trying to juice their numbers, right? Every time one of these colleges gets another kid to apply, that's another kid that they can deny. And I know that sounds really cynical and terrible, but colleges these days often work a lot like a business. Their revenue is a big concern for them. And so when a college receives an extra 10,000 applications at $100 per application, that's an extra $1 million to the college. Nobody's going to turn that down. Even more important to them, though, when they get that extra 10,000 applications, that's a way to move their admissions rate down. They seem more selective. They seem more desirable. That helps them move up this rankings system. And that's where I think the rankings perverts this process a little bit because they're trying to move from number 7 to number 6 to number 5. And they know the best way to do that is to deny more students. And so they try to get more students to apply. And so definitely talk to the college reps, engage with them, listen and learn from them, but take things with a grain of salt because they want as many people to apply as they can possibly get. And what we want to focus on is what's going to help you get in there, not just juice their numbers. So grade inflation, this is the number one driver of schools coming back to SAT and ACT. There was a moment there 2 years ago when it looked like a lot of colleges were just going to do away with the test completely. But the pendulum has really swung back. You've now got the majority of Ivy League schools have gone back to requiring the tests. And this next year, we'll see many, many more competitive colleges go back to requiring it. And even when schools are test optional, they clearly prefer students that have it. Grade inflation is the biggest reason for this. Now, there's a local Orange County private high school. I'm not going to say who it is, but there was a piece on them in LA Magazine. If you want to Google it for yourself and check it out, they showed that the kids graduating from that high school in a particular year had GPAs between 4.25 and 4.65. So that's 4.25 at the low end, 4.65 at the high end. They're clearly not giving out many Bs. They're clearly giving mostly A's, even in AP and honors courses, to have GPAs this high. And what they know is all of their kids don't apply to the same college, right? It's 2 here, 1 there, 3 here at most. And so those colleges don't necessarily know everybody's GPA is high. They just know that the GPAs are really high for the students who applied. We're even seeing public schools get in on some of this action. I uncovered a school district in Ohio, and they have 3 high schools in their school district, 3 high schools, right? And yet last year they graduated 222 valedictorians. How is this possible? Where I come from, the valedictorian is the single person in the high school with the highest GPA at the time of graduation. As I'm sure that's the way most of you think about it, because almost everybody does. This school district decided to redefine valedictorian to be anyone that had a 4.1 or higher GPA. So approximately 20% of their students end up as valedictorians. Now, this has been found out. Now there's news coverage on it. Colleges are aware of it. They're going to have to change it. But they've been doing this since 2016. And until recently, this was virtually unknown because, again, kids are applying to different colleges. All the college admissions officer sees on the transcript is valedictorian for that individual student. So there's been a lot of gaming of GPAs, is my point here. We've got a lot of students graduating with A's. And again, I know I've said this a few times tonight. 2 things can be true at once, right? I do think there's some game playing going on with GPAs. On the other hand, I am amazed by students these days. I think we are right now, the students that are graduating from high school, that are in high school, are the brightest kids I have ever seen. They are so much more aware of the world and complicated issues than I ever was at that age. And so I do think they should be receiving a lot of A's. I do think they're worthy of high GPAs. The issue is that if you're a college admissions officer and you're only admitting 1 out of 10 applications at a particular school, it becomes harder to parse out who you should admit and who you shouldn't. And that's why SAT and ACT have come back in a big way in recent years. Just a little bit, this is some of the actual data from a study that really changed a lot of the schools' minds on SAT and ACT. And to describe it briefly here, so the access, if we look at the left-hand graph there, the one with the yellow dots and the yellow line, that's measuring the correlation between SAT/ACT score going down the bottom and then GPA in college going up the other side. And so if this line were flat, that would mean there's no correlation between these 2 things. As the line gets steeper, it means there's a lot of correlation. And this is a pretty steep line. So we can see from this graph, there's a very tight correlation between standardized test scores and your GPA in college. Now, if we move to the graph on the right, this is the one with the gray dots and gray line. You can see that's a pretty flat line. And that one measures the relationship between high school GPA and its ability to predict grades in college. It doesn't predict grades in college very well, not nearly as well as SAT and ACT scores do. And I think most people on the high school side and on the college side readily recognize the SAT is not an intelligence test. It is not an accurate predictor of your capacity to learn, your capability for the future. That is a fact, and it has been proven. However, Now that these standardized test scores have become great predictors of performance in college, two things can be true at once. It cannot be an intelligence test, but it can be predictive of performance in college. College is going, well, what's the most fair thing to do? We want this to be a meritocratic process. And if these scores predict good grades in college, well, then we better use them. And as it turns out, I won't go through all of these one by one, but you can see here, it turns out standardized test scores are also a better predictor than high school GPA, not only of grades in college, but attending an elite graduate school, working at a prestigious firm, and graduating from college. And then the last one here, this one really sent shockwaves through the college admissions ecosphere because this shows the difference in its ability to predict grades in college for low income versus high income students. The lines are virtually identical. So using these scores does not disadvantage kids from low performing high schools or from low income households. And that's important because a lot of kids, not at modern day necessarily, but a lot of kids who attend low performing high schools don't have access to AP classes. 50% of high schools across America don't have AP calculus. Well, if there's a kid there that wants to go be an engineer, the SAT or the ACT is the best way that that kid that comes from this disadvantaged background can show that they have the chops to compete at a very high level. And so it's more of an equalizer rather than an exacerbation of the income gap. And this research really backs that up. And then the last one here, I know we're getting a little data heavy, but this is an important one for modern day families. Colleges, the difference with low income versus high income, and it's not just income, but if you attended a high performing high school versus a low performing high school. Now we're coming from Southern California, which tends to be a rich area of the country. Modern day would be definitely considered a high performing school. Elite colleges, the highly selective ones, are going to expect a little bit higher scores from students that they would consider advantaged versus disadvantaged ones. And that's what this graph shows here. It tends you can see those lines run together at the end. So as scores get higher, it's the same admission rate for advantaged versus disadvantaged students. But when the scores are a little lower, that's when they give a little preference to students coming from disadvantaged households, because the assumption there is that their education in high school wasn't as strong. Okay, there's a summary slide. You can see all the schools that were included in this study and how this is really why standardized test scores have come back in a big way into this process, because they are now the number one predictor of grades in college, graduation rates, job placement, graduate school placement. Okay, and real quick, I'm going to check my... Sorry about that. Trying to check the chat box here just to see if we have any burning questions. Okay. Yes, this will be recorded and it will be automatically emailed to everybody on this call. Even if they don't attend, this will be sent to you and you'll be able to see all of it. Okay. All right, let's keep humming along here. Okay, UCs. So the UCs continue to be test blind. That means they do not accept SAT and ACT scores. In this current environment where they're not accepting those scores, AP and community college classes tend to carry an outsized importance in this process. So if the UCs are at the top of your list, Cal State's as well, make sure to do well in your AP courses. We want strong grades in those courses, and we want strong scores on the tests at the end of those courses. They will be extra helpful at the UCs and the Cal States. I would note here with the UCs for current sophomores. Now, the California university system cannot use test scores because of a lawsuit that came about during COVID that runs through the end of 2025. They were sued by a group of students with learning differences who required accommodations on the SAT and ACT. The UCs were so worried about the PR fallout that they immediately settled. They knew this was a frivolous lawsuit because during the lockdowns, nobody could take a test in California. It had nothing to do if you needed accommodations or not. In any event, they settled, and part of the settlement was that they wouldn't look at test scores all the way through 2025. So what will happen after that? I think it is anyone's guess because this is a very political question for the college. There's a group of professors who were tasked with doing a extremely in-depth year-long research project on whether or not the UCs should go back to using test scores. They overwhelmingly said the evidence pointed to that they should bring test scores back and at the very least become test optional again. So sophomores should just be aware of that. I don't know that if it will happen or not, because again, it's a political question, but that is what their research said. So there's at least a block within the system that does want to bring back scores. And so just be aware of that if you're a sophomore or a freshman on this call. For the juniors, when you apply, they will still be not looking at SAT and ACT scores, so you won't need them for the UCs and the Cal States. So if we look at this overall test optional landscape, we can get really complicated with this in schools that require it, schools that are test optional, schools that have said they're bringing it back within the next year or two. I'm going to really simplify this for you. The UCs and the Cal States are your test-free or test-blind schools, and there's a handful of other private schools that do that as well, smattered across the country. The other 91.6% of colleges across the country, they're either requiring a test or they would prefer that you have one. And as families, don't sleep on the scholarship opportunities that are still tied to standardized test scores. It was a year before last, and there were these two students. You can see the top one there from 2022, TCU. These two young ladies, they came into our offices. This is early in the test optional change, and Texas Christian University was the top choice for both students. I thought they were twin sisters when I first met them. It turned out they were just best friends, but they had grown up in houses next door to each other. Same financial profile, attended the same preschool all the way up through the same high school, took the same classes in high school, were on the same varsity soccer team, same club team. I mean, they looked identical on paper. And it was really interesting when one of them decided to prep for the ACT and submit a test score, and the other said, I'm not going to. I think I can get in on my grades alone. I thought, what a wonderful experiment, because they're both going all in at TCU. We get the letters back, and we're in touch with both of them because we wanted to know what would happen. And both of them got in to TCU. Sure enough, because TCU says, hey, we don't, in the admissions process, we're not favoring one way or the other. If you have scores, it's an extra piece of information. If you don't have them, that's okay too. And they did both get in. But the student without a test score had to pay full sticker price, which is a pretty penny at TCU these days. The student with a 31 on the ACT received a automatic, right out the door, $112,000 scholarship. That's a huge chunk of change for a family trying to pay for college. And these aren't loans. This never has to be paid back. This is merit-based scholarship money. And it's important to note that the pool of merit-based scholarship money across the country is just as big as the need-based pool for financial aid. And so merit-based aid is primarily based on grades and standardized test scores. And so students who do well on these tests, there are a lot of financial incentives out there available to them. And I would note this 31 on the ACT. The ACT is graded on a 36-point scale. So 31 is very strong. That's a good score, but it's still a long ways from a perfect score. It's an attainable score for many students. And there are rewards if you go down that path. And then finally here, this is a very common question on these webinars and presentations that I give. What is a good score? The answer is there are no good or bad scores, because the score in and of itself doesn't really matter. Just like a grade in a geometry class doesn't really matter to who you are as a person. There are only scores that are going to help you or impede your ability to go reach your goals in the future. So the way that we want to think about this is, and I'm going to make this a little bit smaller so I can share something with everyone. I'm going to share this handout with you guys so you can actually see it. Basically, what we've got here, these are the standardized test scores at the 100 most popular college, not the top ranked, but the most applied to colleges. And what we pulled out for everyone are the SAT and ACT score ranges and the admission rate at these various colleges. So rather than thinking about good scores or bad scores, you want to build that list of colleges and then think about what scores are going to help me get into those schools that I want to go to become the person I want to become. So for instance, if this first student looks at, we'll go right at the second from the top, Pepperdine University, right here in California, 1270 to 1440. That's the middle 50% of students who are admitted to Pepperdine have that score. 25% are lower, 25% are higher. So if you're right in the middle of that range on the SAT, or if you're an ACT test taker between 26 and 31, that's a target school for you. And you can look up the same information regarding your GPA. So that's how we find a target. We're in the middle of that range. Could be high end, could be low end, but that makes it a target school. If we're below that range, then it's probably a reach school for us. It doesn't mean you can't apply there. Again, 25% of students are admitted to these schools with a score below these, right? It just means it's a reach school. It's less likely you'll get in, but you should have some reach schools on your list. And by the way, the Ivy League is a reach school for anybody and everybody on this call. It's gotten that competitive at the top schools. Now, our safety schools are going to be where we're scoring higher than the ranges indicated here. And you can see this same information on Naviance and see specific students from modern day. We just have this handout to make it a little bit easier to quickly go through it, but I would highly recommend using the Naviance tool. Do some research on there. It's great for all families. So at Pepperdine, we'd want to be above a 1440 or above a 31 to incentivize them to give us financial aid. Or if we were looking at another school, if we go down a little further to say Pomona College, well, then we can see, okay, I'm going to need to be north of 1400 to be in the mix at a school like Pomona. It's extremely competitive there. I'm going to need to be north of a 31 on the ACT to be competitive there. So now we've got two incentives to get up on the high end of that range. One, I might get a bunch of scholarship money from Pepperdine. Two, it can make me competitive at a highly competitive school like Pomona. And so that's how you want to use a chart like this and the information on Naviance. And again, you incentivize those schools to try to entice you to come there with free money by having scores and grades that are above their normally admitted students. All right, it's time to get down to that PSAT report. You've got the lay of the land on college admissions. Let's talk about what your scores mean. So on here, you can see the total score on the PSAT. It's just like the SAT, where we just add the math score and the verbal score together, and that gives us a total score. The number that's bubbled next to each of those scores that says on our example here says 88th, 79th, 93rd, that is a percentile. What that means is if this student scored a 1250, they're in the 88th percentile. They scored higher than 88% of PSAT test takers in their grade this year. So these are different numbers. The percentiles are different for sophomores because they are compared to other sophomores. Juniors are compared to juniors. Freshmen are compared to freshmen. I would note here, each section on the PSAT goes from 160 to 760 rather than all the way up to 800 like it does on the normal SAT. So your score is basically capped at 1520 on the PSAT. The reason for this, the highest level difficulty questions are not on the PSAT. So they say you can't get all the way up to a perfect score on the PSAT. So far, so good. Okay. Now, on the right-hand side of your report, we have the National Selection Index score. We're going to get into that one next. The middle section, knowledge and skills, this used to be a lot more robust. There used to be a lot more information here. They don't give you a lot of detail since they switched to the digital version of the PSAT, unfortunately. I will say anyone that takes a practice test with Test Prep Gurus, which since we work with Modern Day, 100% free to any family from Modern Day. If you need an SAT or an ACT score, just contact us through the website. We can give you a free test. One of the things that come with our tests is we give you some really granular information on what the strengths and weaknesses are. We don't just say, oh, in algebra, you did really well or you didn't. We'll actually get down to, okay, ratio problems seem to be an issue for you. That's something you want to fix. Whereas solving quadratic equations seems like something that is a strength, and you probably don't need to spend time studying that. And that granular information can be very, very useful and helpful in the preparation process. Key point here. Average score for a sophomore on the PSAT is 910 to 920. Average score for a junior is 1,000. Most kids that talk about their scores at school scored much higher than this, right? Because the kids that scored, let's say 800 on the PSAT, they're not telling everybody. But that one kid that scored a 1520 is telling anyone and everyone who will listen. Oftentimes, this warps our sense of what the average really is. I see so many parents and kids saying, oh, my kid blew it. He or she scored a 1420 on the PSAT. That is not blowing it. That's actually doing extremely well. It's just everybody's sense of what is normal gets warped because of the conversation at lunch. Remember, it's only the kids with high scores that share their scores in general. So those averages are real. That's for California and for nationwide. And again, that a good score just depends on what our future goals are for the scores to get into the schools we want to go to. If you didn't do as well as you'd hoped, this is a good feedback mechanism, right? If your scores aren't as strong as you wanted them to be, well, we don't want to think of this as a judgment on our abilities. I think school often warps our sense of what a test is and should be, right? Because in school, we're taught something, then we get a test and we consider that an evaluation and we just move on, right? You're either good at it or you're not good at it, and that's it. But in normal life, whether you're running a marketing campaign or you're creating an AI or you're testing out a new app, anybody that works in an industry like that will tell you testing is a feedback loop. Testing is just part of the process. And you can see that circular graph on your screen there. It's more like try something, test, take the information it gives you, then try something new. In fact, this is really how algorithms work. They're constantly testing, taking the feedback from the test, and then adjusting the approach that it takes, and then test again, new feedback, adjust again. And algorithms do that in an infinite loop in ever greater efficiency. I want you to think about standardized tests and heck, tests in school as the same way. It's not a judgment on your capability. If you're not doing well, think about, well, I'm not doing well yet. It's information on what you need to work on in order to do better. And I can tell you firsthand from working in the test prep industry for over 15 years now. I think I've actually been working in it for more than 20. The amount of improvement that is possible on these exams far exceeds what you think is possible for you. But the first step to improvement is learning that any score you get is just feedback and information to help you focus on the right things to raise that score in the future. Okay, so on that right-hand side of your report, there's the National Merit Selection Index score. This is on a whole different scoring scale. I don't want to go too deep in the weeds here, but what they do is they drop the 0 on each of your scores. So if you had a 600 on the math, they would just count that as 60. If you had a 560 on the verbal, they would just count that as 56. But they double the verbal score and then add the math score. And that's how they get to this weird scale between 48 and 228. The important thing to know here is that The selection index score is tied to the National Merit Scholarship when you take the test as a junior. Sophomore year does not count in this competition. It only counts your junior year. The cutoff in California, we expect for this year, will be 221. Could be 1 point higher, 1 point lower, but we're pretty sure it's going to be 221 based on the data we've seen. If you score 221 or higher in fall of your senior year, your counselor, maybe Miss Huey herself, will contact you and say, congratulations, you're in the National Merit Scholarship competition now. You're going to be a semifinalist or better. This is all good news, right? The PSAT, no one on the college side is ever going to see your PSAT score. The only exception to that is if you did extremely well and you ended up a National Merit semifinalist or a winner. The reason people get so excited about that, the reason colleges get excited about it, kids and parents get excited about it, the reward if you win the scholarship competition is only $2,500, but it is a big gold star on your resume for when you apply to college. And there are huge scholarships associated with scoring that high on the junior PSAT. For instance, Boston University, they recently changed this, but for years they've had an automatic $100,000 scholarship if you are a National Merit semifinalist or better and you get admitted to the college. You automatically get $100,000 plus whatever else they decide to give you as soon as you're admitted. They recently changed that to include both those PSAT National Merit semifinalists or better and kids who scored just as high on the SAT or ACT. This is a good change. This is the way things are moving in general, because if you didn't hit it junior year, let's say you scored a 219 or 220, you're this close but didn't quite make it, it's fine. All you've got to do is a little bit more work, earn a score that is equivalent to that on an official SAT or ACT. You're going to have access to the same scholarship opportunities. Just understand that the big scholarship opportunities associated with the National Merit Scholarship Competition come from the individual colleges when you apply to them, not necessarily from this governing body, that hosts the National Merit Scholarship Competition. Okay, and that's what we've got there. Oh, and last piece on that. Do know that it is extremely competitive. It's roughly the top 1% of PSAT scores for all of California. It's a state-by-state competition, so it's a lot easier to win it if you're in Montana or Delaware than it is in California or Texas. But hey, we get to live in California, so I think it all balances out in the end. Let's see. We just covered all of this. Oh, yes. And that shows that trustee and university scholarships at Boston have actually increased from that automatic $100,000 scholarship, because that was $25,000 per year. Now they range from $42,000 to $82,000 a year. I mean, it's a tear-jerking price at Boston these days. But they do have these scholarships available, highly tied to standardized test scores. And for my sophomores, freshmen on the call, if you scored a 1,300 on your PSAT cold without any preparation, then you might want to consider prepping for the junior year PSAT because you're in striking distance of that national merit cutoff. And so that's a good sign that you're scoring high enough that you probably want to, you may want to consider prepping for that junior year PSAT to increase your chances of hitting that score. And then as we round this thing out, we're coming right to the finish line here. We're just going to talk about what to do next, grade by grade. So we've got the SAT. We covered that one, just a math and verbal score. It is completely digital. There is no paper-based version of the SAT any longer. The ACT is a little different. ACT is a 1 to 36 point scale. There are 4 sections, which you can see on your screen there, including a science section. Although the science section, a couple things about that. One, it doesn't have much to do with science. It's more like science-based critical reading. So you don't need physics knowledge, chemistry knowledge, biology knowledge to do well on it. The second piece on the science section is it's going away this summer. They're going to make it optional, and most colleges are not going to care whether you take it or not. The reason ACT is doing this is when SAT went digital it became a shorter test. And so now ACT, they're going, wow, these kids want to take the shorter test. We got to make our test shorter. So they're going to make that science section optional as of this summer. You are perfectly fine as a junior to take the ACT as it exists now and take the new version when it comes out in the summer or September. It's basically the same test without the science section. You will be able to still super score, combine the scores. So there's nothing to worry about there in taking one version now and a different version later. ACT averages their scores together rather than adding them up. So each section is scored 1 to 36, and then you average those numbers together. There is and will be a paper-based version of the ACT available in perpetuity. So that's another difference with the SAT. If you find you dramatically perform better on a paper-based test rather than a digital test, that will come out when you take the practice exams. And ACT is rolling out this digital version in the summer and the fall, but again, paper will still be available. And what we have found is the vast majority of students perform better on the paper-based version of the ACT than they do the digital version. Part of it just has to do with when you're on a phone, you're just used to scrolling and you don't read very carefully. And so students just tend to perform better on the paper-based version of the exam. So it is a good idea to take your practice ACT on paper to see where you're at versus that digital SAT. Because what we want to do, the first step for 10th graders, for 11th graders, is to take one of each. You've taken the PSAT. Now you want to take a mock ACT, and then you're going to compare those scores. For anyone that needs, actually, I'm going to share this timetable with you while I've got it up here on the screens, because there's a lot to look at there. This is just a good one to download and then check it out when you have a little bit more time. So that download option should pop up on your screen there. And you can see this, the way that we look at these timelines, we want it to be balanced and flexible, right? So ideally, the summer after sophomore year, you put a testing plan in place. Students that are already scoring really high, they might test early in the process. Students that need more time to develop aren't going to test early in the process. I still like everybody to have a plan. Have an SAT and an ACT, compare those scores, figure out which test is better for you. Remember that every college accepts either SAT or ACT. Nobody prefers one or the other. So you just want to figure out which test you score higher on naturally, and then we'll just run with that single exam. Then you're going to want to plot out when it would make sense for you to take 3 official tests for SAT or ACT. You aren't even necessarily going to take it 3 times, but I want you to plot them out and know when they're going to be in the future. This lowers the stress level for the student, for the parents. Everybody's going to get along better just knowing what's coming down the road. Anytime we can plan ahead in college admissions, it lowers anxiety and makes sure everybody knows what's coming. And that makes the process run a lot more smoothly. The college admissions process has the ability to divide families or bring them together. And planning well really helps for it to be a positive experience that brings people together. So key thing there is at the end of sophomore year, as you get into the summer, we want to have a practice test for each one. And then we want to put that plan together. Whether you're going to start prepping or not depends on the individual, but you put the plan in place. For anybody that wants a free mock ACT exam to compare to your PSAT, you can visit us there at www.prepgurus.com, and we will set you up with a free practice ACT test. You can take that at home or in one of our test centers on the weekends. We regularly run practice tests for many, many students who are either prepping with us or are just want to learn more about the ACT or SAT. And I think I can also put up an easier one too that you can just click that will take you right there. There we go. I'm just going to share that on your screen for anyone that wants to set up that practice exam. Okay. And then something that will go out in the email that we send to everybody with the recording. is this link right here to this video. Because this is one of the other questions that we get every single webinar. If my kid isn't a great test taker, should he or she bother to test? We put together a short interview. It's a 6 minutes long, I think. That's at this link, and we can send that link to you. I don't think we'll send that link to you in the follow-up email. But it's an interview with the student. She was in Massachusetts this just recently, and she scored a 22 on the ACT, right? So she's in the middle of the pack. She really wanted to play lacrosse at Amherst. The coach really liked her as a lacrosse player at Amherst, but he was honest with her and said, hey, with a 22, you're probably not going to get in here. This is a really competitive school. Great GPA. I like where you went to school. I like the way you play, but the score is holding you back. So they decided they were going to turn that weakness into a strength. And she got really into the process because she had a clear goal, knew where she wanted to go. She said, Amherst, it's the right school for me sports-wise and to become the person I want to become. So she was very motivated. She ended up moving from a 22 on the ACT to a 34. So she went from the middle of the pack to the top 1%. Now, this is not a typical result by any means, but I think it's a great story in that it shows what's possible for a motivated student who wants to take control of this part of the process and be in control of their destiny. I would also note something that was great in the interview, and we hear this from a lot of students, is that when the prep process is done in the right way, they find that it improves their grades in school. And the best part of it is that not only do their grades go up, but they spend less time studying because they learn how to prepare more effectively. They really learn that testing as a feedback framework and use it to study to figure out, do I know what I need to know for this exam? Or do I have holes in what I need to be prepared for this exam? And I thought it was great. She said, I used to spend 3 days studying for my history test and I was getting B's. Now I spend 3 to 5 hours in total and I'm getting A's. She said, I almost feel guilty that this is so much easier. But she attributed that to what she learned working with her tutors at Test Prep Gurus. And so it's a great story. Now, last bit on super scoring before we call it a night here. One of the reasons we want kids to take whether they go SAT or ACT, take the test twice officially is that one, students tend to do better the second time they take the test than the first, just becoming comfortable with the exam and having a little bit more schooling behind them. Two, more than half of the schools that look at SAT and ACT do something called super scoring, which is if you send them two full test scores. So for example, we've got Johnny up on the screen here, and you can see he scored a 30 composite score, right? Because we average those 4 scores. He's got a 30 in April. He takes it again in September, scores a 30 again. But the first time he took it, math and science were highest. And the second time he took it, English and reading were highest. Well, when this school looks at his scores, so long as Johnny sends both of the scores to that school, they will cherry pick the best scores. And when they look at his file, when they're evaluating him, they see Johnny's super score, which now puts his composite at a 32. And a move from 30 to 32 can be the difference, one of those make or break differences that gets that admissions officer to go, oh, he can compete academically. Let's look at his essays. Let's look at the letters of recommendation. Let's look at his activities and figure out who this kid is, because maybe he'll really fit in here. So definitely take advantage of that. And then final thought for the students here. Don't think of these tests as assessments. Think of them as opportunities to win scholarships, gain access to selective colleges, and build skills for the future. Couple of other things. We'll send you a couple of videos in that follow-up email. I won't get into those now because we are at 7 o'clock. So we're going to wind this thing down. But I will, if anybody has questions, feel free to email me through the website. I will get back to you, or one of our team members will get back to you. If anybody wants that practice test, you can scan that QR code with your phone, and that will also take you there to sign up for a free practice ACT, so you can take the next step in comparing your scores. And that is, I'm going to check the chat for questions, and Let's see here. Okay, Olivia is answering questions. Great. So she's been all over it. Looks like we're good to go there. And then I'm going to put out one last poll before we call it a night. If you would take a second to rate the webinar, that would be most appreciated. Oh, thank you. We've got some very nice feedback coming in. Appreciate those 5 stars. If you're going to give it 1 star, feel free to log off. There's no need to click it. Okay, thank you so much for your time and energy tonight, and thank you for the nice comments there and the poll answers. And that's everything I've got. We look forward to working with modern day families in the future and just being a resource in any way that we can. We're all teachers within this group, and we've really enjoyed all the modern day families that we've spent time with over the years. And thank you to Olivia for inviting us tonight. And I hope everyone has an excellent evening, and I will see you again next time. All right. Good night.